What if I told you that over 50% of rock stars struggled with addiction and many never made it out alive? From psychedelic visionaries lost in paranoia to punk icons who didn't care if they lived or died. Here are 30 worst junkies in rock and roll history. 1. Elvis Presley. The king of rock and roll was Elvis Presley. He was rich and famous, but his life was not perfect. He took too many pills. These substances helped him stay awake, sleep, and stop his pain. But they also hurt his body. Elvis had a busy life. He sang, acted in movies, and always had to make fans happy. This made him tired. Instead of resting, he took more pills to keep going. His friends, called the Memphis Mafia, gave him whatever he wanted. No one told him to stop. By the late 1960s, Elvis changed. He gained weight, his face looked puffy, and he talked slowly. On stage, he sometimes forgot the words to his songs. He became paranoid and afraid, but still, no one helped him. 2. David Bowie. In the mid-1970s, Bowie was very thin. He barely ate, living on milk and red peppers. He stayed in Los Angeles, a city full of bright lights and wild parties. But the substances made him think people were watching him. He was scared of witches and even kept his urine so no one could use it against him. His friends worried about him, but they could not help. 3. Kurt Cobain. The voice of a generation was Kurt Cobain, but fame weighed heavily on him. He wore flannel shirts and wrote songs filled with pain. But behind the music, he struggled. He had a stomach illness that caused him pain, and he turned to opioids for relief. At first it helped, but soon he couldn't stop. It became a trap he couldn't escape. As Nirvana became famous, Cobain sank deeper into addiction. His eyes looked empty, his body was there, but his mind was lost. He struggled through interviews, barely able to stay present. On stage, he could be brilliant or completely out of it. Not even love, fame, or his baby daughter could free him from opioids. In March 1994, Cobain overdosed in Rome. Some said it was an accident. Others thought it was a warning. A month later, he was gone. In Seattle, he was found with a shotgun and a note. The opioids in his system were so high that some questioned if he could have pulled the trigger. Was his end planned, or had he simply given up? Jimi Hendrix. Through his guitar, Jimi Hendrix spoke, creating music like magic. But magic has a price. He lived in the wild world of the 1960s, where substances like LSD were everywhere. LSD inspired his music, but it also changed his mind. He saw things that weren't there, heard whispers in silence. His famous headbands were soaked with substances, sinking into his skin, pulling him deeper into another world. But LSD wasn't his only problem. Alcohol turned him into someone else. When he drank, he became angry and out of control. His hands, made for music, sometimes hurt the people around him. His creative mind became a battlefield of chaos. 5. Jim Morrison. A poet and a rock star, Jim Morrison was the wild leader of the Doors. He didn't just try substances, he drowned in them. Unlike others who used substances for creativity, Morrison seemed to want to disappear. He took huge amounts of LSD, living in a dreamlike world where reality faded away. On stage, he could be amazing or completely out of control. Alcohol was his real weakness. He was almost never seen without a drink. He got arrested many times for his drunken behavior. One night in 1969, he shocked a crowd in Miami, and the scandal followed him for years. The strong, magnetic man people once loved started to change. He became bloated, distant, and lost in his own world. Friends watched him wander the streets, drunk and alone, writing poetry that only he understood. In 1971, he moved to Paris, maybe to escape, maybe to give up. But addiction doesn't let go so easily. One morning, he was found dead in his bathtub. He was only 27. No autopsy was done. No clear answer was given. 6. Janis Joplin. A voice full of fire and a heart full of pain belonged to Janis Joplin. She sang with deep emotion, her voice shaking with every note. More than just a singer, she was a wild and free spirit. She loved music, but she also loved drinking and substances. Southern Comfort was her drink of choice, and opioids became her biggest problem. Unlike others who hid their struggles, Joplin was open about hers. She talked about her drinking and wild behavior, never pretending to be something she wasn't. As she became more famous, her substance use got worse. She would disappear for days and come back looking tired and empty. Millions of people loved her, but she still felt alone. Her life was like a swing moving between joy and deep sadness, and opioids was a chain she couldn't break. Her friends tried to help her, but she didn't want to be saved. She chased the feeling of being high the same way she chased love and approval. 7. Ozzy Osbourne. The Prince of Darkness was Ozzy Osbourne, who lived a life full of wild choices and near-death experiences. He didn't just try dangerous things, he went all in. Even his bandmates, who also lived recklessly, couldn't keep up with him. By the late 1970s, he was spending huge amounts of money on substances and alcohol, locking himself in hotel rooms where time seemed to disappear. His crazy stories became legends. Once he got so drunk and high that he urinated on the Alamo while wearing his wife's clothes. The city of San Antonio banned him for life. Another time, he bit the head off a bat on stage, thinking it was fake. He had to get emergency rabies treatment. When he ran out of stimulants, he snorted a line of ants, shocking even his fellow rock stars. His addiction swallowed everything: his mind, his relationships, and his identity. 8. Eric Clapton. Struggling with addiction for many years was Eric Clapton. In the early 1970s, he became addicted to opioids. The substance took over his life, draining his money and his health. He spent thousands of dollars every week on opioids. He became weak and isolated, unable to play music. His hair thinned, his body grew frail, and his mind sank into deep sadness. Friends and family had to step in to help him. When he returned to the stage, his performance was shaky. The substance had nearly taken everything from him. Clapton eventually quit opioids, but he started drinking heavily instead. He drank so much that he often blacked out. He was angry and depressed. He played shows while drunk, and his addiction made him think about ending his life. But he refused to give up. He fought through his struggles and kept trying to stay sober. It took many years and many relapses, but by the late 1980s, he finally won the battle. The guitarist of the Rolling Stones was Keith Richards, who lived through years of heavy substance use. He used opioids and stimulants for much of the 1970s. Many musicians did not survive addiction, but Richards somehow did. Despite his substance use, he kept making music and performing. During the 1970s, opioids controlled his life. He was arrested many times, including a serious case in Canada in 1977. He was so addicted that he relied on a substance dealer to measure out his doses carefully, just enough to keep him going, but not enough to end his life. He overdosed several times, coming close to death more than once. People around him had to work fast to bring him back. He lived through moments that could have ended his life, but he always bounced back. 10. Iggy Pop. Known as the godfather of punk, Iggy Pop had a wild and reckless life. He didn't just use substances, he let them take over his body and mind. He became a symbol of punk rock's raw and dangerous energy. In the 1970s, his substance use spun out of control. He performed crazy shows with the Stooges, often hurting himself on stage. He threw himself into crowds, broke glass over his body, and screamed into the microphone. Off stage, he was just as reckless. He often woke up in strange places, dirty hotel rooms, alleys, or even at dumpsters. His friends left him, his money disappeared, and his mind started to break down. He had terrifying hallucinations and deep paranoia. 11. Anthony Kiedis. The lead singer of the Red Hot Chili Peppers was Anthony Kiedis, who grew up surrounded by substances. His father introduced him to narcotics at a young age, not realizing the damage it would cause. By the time Kiedis was a teenager, he was already addicted to opioids. As his band became famous, his addiction worsened. He performed on stage while high, sometimes barely able to stand. His voice was weak, his body exhausted. Things got worse when his close friend and bandmate, Hillel Slovak, died from a substance overdose. Instead of quitting, Kiedis fell even deeper into addiction. For years, he drifted from one substance house to another. He overdosed many times, waking up in strange places with no memory of how he got there. His bandmates thought about kicking him out, but somehow he managed to fight his way back. 12. Steven Tyler. The lead singer of Aerosmith was Steven Tyler, who had a powerful voice and a wild stage presence. But behind the scenes, he was battling a serious substance problem. Along with his bandmate Joe Perry, he became known as one half of the Toxic Twins because of their extreme substance use. Tyler spent huge amounts of money on stimulants and opioids. He even had a special belt designed to carry his substances. Over time, his body and mind suffered. His voice grew weak and his health declined. He started missing band practices and sometimes showed up too high to perform. Aerosmith was on the edge of falling apart. His bandmates knew they had to do something. They staged an intervention and forced him into rehab. At first, Tyler resisted, not wanting to admit he had a problem. 13. John Bonham. The powerhouse drummer of Led Zeppelin was John Bonham. His drumming was loud, fast, and full of energy. But off stage, he struggled with a serious drinking problem. Unlike other rock stars who used substances, Bonham's battle was with alcohol. He didn't just drink to have fun, he drank to escape. Bonham could drink more than most people without passing out. He would finish whole bottles of whiskey in one night. As time passed, his drinking became worse. When he was drunk, he sometimes became angry and lashed out at those around him. His friends and bandmates worried about him, but they couldn't stop him. His drinking caused problems for the band. Concerts were delayed, and sometimes he was too drunk to play. His bandmates had to carry him on stage, hoping he would wake up in time to perform. Everyone walked on eggshells, not knowing when he might have another outburst. Still, no one could have predicted the tragedy that was coming. On September 24, 1980, Bonham drank 40 shots of vodka in one day. He passed out, and his friends put him to bed. By the next morning, he was gone. He had choked in his sleep. His death was a huge loss for Led Zeppelin. Without him, the band decided to break up. 14. Chester Bennington. The lead singer of Linkin Park was Chester Bennington. His voice was powerful and full of emotion. When he sang, people could feel his pain. But behind the music, Chester fought a battle with addiction and depression. His struggle started when he was young. He faced terrible experiences as a child that left deep emotional scars. As a teenager, he turned to substances like methamphetamine to cope with his pain. His life spiraled out of control. But music gave him a reason to keep going. It became his way of expressing his feelings and escaping his troubles. When Linkin Park became famous, Chester inspired millions of fans. He turned his pain into powerful music. But his addiction never fully went away. He went in and out of rehab, trying to fight his demons. Sometimes he seemed to be doing better. Other times he fell back into old habits. His friends worried about him, but addiction is a tough battle. In his later years, Chester spoke openly about his struggles. He wanted to help others who were going through the same thing. It seemed like he was winning his fight. But when his close friend, Chris Cornell, died in 2017, Chester took it very hard. The pain was too much for him. 15. Chris Cornell. A voice like no other belonged to Chris Cornell. It was powerful, full of emotion, and unforgettable. He was a leader in grunge music, a songwriter who put his pain into words. But even great voices can be silenced by addiction. Since he was young, substances and alcohol followed him. They seemed like a way to escape his sadness, but instead, they trapped him. As he became more famous, his struggles got worse. Sometimes he disappeared, locking himself away in his own darkness. Chris tried to fight back. He wanted to be free. His family, friends, and fans saw him struggle. He talked about hope, but was he ever truly safe from his demons? On May 17, 2017, he performed in Detroit. It was his last show. A few hours later, he was found dead in his hotel room. The official cause was self-inflicted death, but substances were found in his system. Did he mean to end his life, or did the substances push him too far? 16. John Frusciante. A guitar genius was John Frusciante. His music was electric, full of energy, and loved by many. But talent often comes with struggles, and John had his own battles. In the early 1990s, he left the Red Hot Chili Peppers, not just quitting the band, but disappearing into addiction. His home turned into a nightmare. Substances were everywhere. He was sick, his body weak, his teeth rotting. He barely looked human anymore. He still made music, but it was strange and eerie, like something from another world. He was falling apart, but he couldn't stop using it. Death was close. He overdosed many times. His friends feared the worst. He sold everything, his guitars, his past, his memories, just to get more substances. Then, in 1997, something changed. He got a serious infection that nearly ended his life. This forced him into treatment. It was painful, but he survived. He slowly got better and returned to music, stronger than before. His comeback brought some of his most beautiful songs, proving that even those who are lost can find their way back. 17. Nikki Sixx. Death was not just a risk for Nikki Sixx. He welcomed it. By the mid-1980s, his body was full of opioids and stimulants running through his veins like poison. He was no longer just a man, but a shadow of himself, broken by addiction. Substances took over his mind. He saw things that weren't there and heard voices in the silence. He believed creatures lived in the walls of his home. With a shotgun in his hands, he hunted these imagined monsters, lost in fear and paranoia. Then came December 23, 1987. That night, a deadly dose of opioids shut down his body. His heart stopped. The world around him faded, and his body went limp. For 2 minutes, Nikki Sixx was dead. But fate had other plans. A paramedic jammed a needle into his chest, and his heart started beating again. He gasped for air as life returned to him. He had escaped death. 18. Vince Neil. On December 8, 1984, he drove drunk with Nicholas Razzle Dingley, drummer of Hanoi Rocks, in the passenger seat. The car sped down the road, out of control. Then came the crash. Metal twisted, glass shattered, and everything changed in an instant. Razzle was dead. 2 others were seriously injured, and Neil was to blame. But despite causing a fatal accident, his punishment was shockingly light, just 15 days in jail. The world watched in disbelief as he walked free, while others suffered forever. The tragedy should have been a wake-up call, but it wasn't. Instead of turning his life around, Neil fell deeper into alcohol misuse. His performances became sloppy, his voice lost its power, and his once great stage presence faded. Fans who once cheered for him now saw a man crumbling under his own choices. Years passed, arrests piled up, but Neil didn't stop. While some found a way to break free from addiction, he never fully escaped. Alcohol remained his greatest enemy, a shadow that followed him wherever he went. 19. Scott Weiland. A talented singer, but one whose struggles with substances made his life difficult, was Scott Weiland. He was the lead singer of Stone Temple Pilots and later joined Velvet Revolver. His powerful voice and stage presence made him famous, but his addiction to opioids and stimulants hurt his career and personal life. In the mid-1990s, Weiland started having trouble with the law because of substances. He went in and out of rehab many times, but staying sober was hard. When he was clean, he was an amazing performer. When he wasn't, he caused problems for his band. Stone Temple Pilots had to cancel tours and stop making music at times because of his addiction. In December 2015, Weiland was found dead on his tour bus. His years of substance use had taken a serious toll. His death was sad, but many people had seen it coming. Despite his talent, he could not escape his struggles. 20. Layne Staley. A unique voice that was full of emotion and pain belonged to Layne Staley. He was the lead singer of Alice in Chains, and his music often told the story of his battle with addiction. Unlike some other rock stars, he did not make substance use seem cool. Instead, he sang about how it destroyed his life. Even when Alice in Chains was at its most successful, Staley was losing his fight with opioids. He became more withdrawn, rarely appearing in public. By the late 1990s, he had almost disappeared completely. He avoided his friends, stayed away from the music industry, and spent most of his time alone. He knew he was dying, and he seemed to accept it. Over time, his health got worse. He lost a lot of weight, his teeth rotted, and he became very weak. He lived in isolation, surrounded by the substances that were destroying him. Even those who cared about him couldn't reach him. In April 2002, Staley was found dead in his apartment. He had been gone for weeks before anyone even noticed. It was a tragic end for someone who once stood in front of thousands, singing with a voice that could touch the soul. Despite his fame, he died alone, trapped by the addiction that had controlled his life. 21. Lemmy Kilmister. Different from everyone else, Lemmy Kilmister was a man who never gave up. Where others fell, he stood tall. His addictions didn't destroy him. They became part of his story. He loved speed, and he lived life as fast as possible, never slowing down. For over 40 years, Lemmy drank whiskey like it was water and took substances like they were food. His body should have stopped working, but it didn't. Doctors were shocked. His body had changed so much from years of substances that stopping them could have been more dangerous than continuing. He was proof that the human body can survive more than people think. Lemmy barely slept. He stayed awake for days, powered by substances. His life wasn't a warning. It was an example of pure willpower. He played music, partied, and outlived many other rock stars who tried to keep up with him. He seemed unstoppable, but no one can fight time forever. In his later years, he got very sick. He had diabetes, heart problems, and then cancer. The cancer moved quickly, and he passed away just days after learning about it. He left behind a wild legacy, just like the life he lived. 22. Pete Doherty. Not just a musician, but a mess. Pete Doherty was the leader of the Libertines and Baby Shambles. He was known for his great songs, but also for ruining his own life. His substance addiction wasn't a secret, it was public. He used opioids and crack stimulants all the time, turning his life into a disaster that everyone could see. The streets of London were his stage. He walked them looking pale and sick, always searching for his next high. He was arrested over and over again, sometimes just days apart. His mug shots showed a man falling apart. His bandmates waited for him at practice, at concerts, at airports, but he would disappear to use substances instead. Even love couldn't save him. His relationship with supermodel Kate Moss, full of love and chaos, ended because of his addiction. He even sneaked opioids into rehab by hiding them in a child's toy. He tried to quit, but he always went back. His music showed his pain, but no song could fix his problems. Somehow, he survived, but at a huge cost. 23. Sid Vicious. Wild and reckless, Sid Vicious was the bassist of the Pistols. He cared more about chaos than music. He was the face of punk's reckless spirit, but he was never in control. Once he started using opioids, his fate was set. His relationship with Nancy Spungen was a disaster. They were lost in addiction and violence. By 19, Sid was already deep into substances. He mumbled in interviews, fell apart on stage, and even hurt himself just for shock. His performances were bloody and disturbing, like a real-life horror show. Then came the worst part. Nancy was found dead in a hotel room with a stab wound. Sid was the main suspect. He got out on bail, but sank even deeper into substances. On February 2, 1979, he overdosed on opioids. It was his last escape. He was only 21. 24. Brian Jones. More than just a guitarist, Brian Jones started the Rolling Stones and helped create their sound. But while the band became famous, Brian lost control. Substances and alcohol took over his life. A few weeks later, he was found dead in his swimming pool. Substances and alcohol had taken their toll. He was only 27. 25. Jerry Garcia. The leader of the Grateful Dead, a famous band known for its wild and colorful music, was Jerry Garcia. Fans loved him, but he had a big problem. He was addicted to opioids. At first, he used LSD, a substance that helped create the Grateful Dead's special sound. But over time, he turned to opioids. It made him feel numb. His hands didn't move as easily, his voice became weak, and he lost the energy that once made him great. His fans still cheered for him, but he was fading away. On August 9, 1995, Jerry Garcia died in a rehab center. His body couldn't take the years of substance use anymore. People all over the world mourned his death, but his music still lives on. 26. Dave Gahan. The lead singer of Depeche Mode, a band known for its dark and emotional songs, is Dave Gahan. In the early 1990s, he became addicted to opioids and stimulants. He was famous, but his personal life was falling apart. Gahan pushed away the people who cared about him and surrounded himself with others who used substances. His days became a cycle. Wake up, use substances, take pills, and repeat. He was slowly destroying himself. On May 28, 1996, in a hotel room in Los Angeles, Gahan took a dangerous mix of opioids and stimulants. His heart stopped for 2 minutes. When he woke up, paramedics told him, "Welcome back to life." But Gahan wasn't sure if he wanted to be back. Most people would see this as a wake-up call, but not Gahan. He left the hospital and went back to substances. His body was shutting down, but he didn't stop. Later that year, he was arrested and given a choice: prison or rehab. He chose rehab. Phil Lynott. The heart of Thin Lizzy was Phil Lynott. His music was powerful, his stage presence electric. Fans saw a rock star, but behind the scenes he struggled. Substances and alcohol slowly took over his life. He tried to hide his addiction, but it became impossible to ignore. By the early 1980s, he was a different man. Once full of energy, he became weak. His hands shook, his body wasted away, and his dreams faded. Thin Lizzy broke up, and Lynott spiraled deeper into addiction. He held on to his career, but the substances held on to him tighter. His downfall came fast. On Christmas Day in 1985, his body gave up. He was rushed to the hospital, suffering from organ failure and a severe infection. Just days later, on January 4, 1986, he passed away. He was only 36 years old. 28. Johnny Thunders. Rock and roll in its rawest form was Johnny Thunders. As a guitarist for the New York Dolls and the Heartbreakers, he lived fast and recklessly. He didn't just use substances, he let them define him. His name became a symbol of self-destruction. Unlike some, Thunders didn't try to hide his struggles. He showed up on stage barely able to play, sometimes brilliant, sometimes a mess. His body fell apart, his teeth rotted, his skin turned pale, and his health faded. Even among addicts, his condition was extreme. He tried rehab many times, but opioids always won. By the early 1990s, he was only a shadow of himself. Then, on April 23, 1991, he was found dead in a New Orleans hotel room. Officially, the cause was leukemia and substances. But the details were strange. His belongings were missing, and his room was ransacked. Some believe he was given poisoned opioids. Others think he was robbed and left to die. The truth remains a mystery. Living in chaos, Gigi Allin didn't just play music. He made destruction his way of life. He wasn't like other rock stars who got lost in substances by accident. Opioids weren't just something he used. They were part of his identity. He wanted to destroy everything normal. His concerts were wild and dangerous. He didn't just sing, he attacked his audience. He cut himself with glass, covered himself in filth, and even threw his own waste at the crowd. Some people saw him as fearless, others as disgusting. No one forgot his shows. Substances weren't an escape for Gigi, they were his fuel. He never wanted to be clean. He talked about dying on stage, making his own death the final act. His life was full of crime, fighting, public indecency, substance possession. Even prison couldn't stop him. The moment he was free, he went straight back to his reckless life. On June 27, 1993, he finally lost the battle. After another violent show in New York, he overdosed at a party. His body lay there for hours before anyone even cared. Instead of mourning, people took photos of his corpse. His funeral was just as chaotic. Fans poured alcohol and substances over his body. Shannon Hoon, having it all, a unique voice, a promising band, and a future full of success, was Shannon Hoon. But addiction stole it all away. He should have been a legend, but instead, he became another musician lost to substances. Blind Melon became famous fast. Their song, No Rain, made them stars. But behind the success, Shannon was struggling. He didn't just experiment with substances. He was trapped. Opioids and stimulants followed him everywhere, on stage and off. He tried to fight. He went to rehab, tried to stay clean, and made promises to change. His bandmates saw him falling apart and did everything they could. They even hired someone to watch over him on tour, hoping to save him from himself. For a moment, there was hope. In 1995, his daughter was born. People thought maybe fatherhood would save him. But addiction is a tough enemy. The pressure of fame, his personal struggles, it was too much. On October 21, 1995, it ended. Alone on the band's tour bus in New Orleans, he took his final dose. He was only 28 years old. The world lost a powerful voice that day. Blind Melon lost its heart. Shannon's death wasn't just sad, it was a warning. Addiction doesn't care how talented you are. It takes even the brightest stars and pulls them into darkness.